Section 1. The Quietude of Chipping Cleghorn. The sleepy village of Chipping Cleghorn was a place where time seemed to glide smoothly, like the surface of a still pond. There was a comforting rhythm to life here, each day blending seamlessly into the next, as predictable as the seasonal changes. Nestled in the rolling hills of southern England, Chipping Cleghorn was the type of place that could be described as quaint, without any sense of irony. It was a picturesque village where whitewashed cottages dotted the landscape. The sweet smell of freshly baked bread wafted from Mrs. Butterworth's bakery, and the chatter of friendly villagers filled the air. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Well, almost everyone's. Miss Jane Marple, the village's most revered and yet unassuming resident, had lived in Chipping Cleghorn for as long as anyone could remember. Though she was nearly 80, Miss Marple had long ago mastered the art of blending in with her surroundings. She was the epitome of quiet observation, often slipping unnoticed into the background of any gathering. Her presence only occasionally noted when a particularly insightful remark escaped her lips, causing others to pause and reconsider their assumptions. The local gentry, while outwardly polite, had long viewed Miss Marple as a curiosity, a gentle old spinster with a penchant for knitting and bird-watching. But those who had spent enough time in her company knew that Miss Marple was far from ordinary. Beneath her soft demeanour and seemingly frail frame lay a mind as sharp as a tack. In fact, Miss Marple had spent decades observing the intricate dance of human behaviour, and she knew as well as anyone that there were always secrets lurking beneath the surface of even the most idyllic villages. And so it was on one unassuming Thursday afternoon that she would once again find herself at the centre of a mystery that would shake the village to its core. The occasion was an afternoon tea, hosted by Mrs. Letitia Blackwood, the wealthy widow, who lived in the large, slightly ramshackle manor on the edge of the village. Letitia, though not particularly well liked by some of the other villagers due to her social ambition and occasional airs of superiority, was nothing if not gracious when it came to her social gatherings. Her tea parties were legendary in Chipping Cleghorn, and no self-respecting resident would dream of turning down an invitation. The room was always impeccably arranged, with fine china, freshly brewed tea, and an array of sandwiches that would have impressed even the most discerning of guests. For Miss Marple, these affairs were both a source of quiet amusement and an opportunity to observe the ever-shifting dynamics of village life. As she entered the drawing-room of Mrs. Blackwood's manor, Miss Marple found herself greeted by a familiar cast of characters, each one a puzzle in their own right. The first to approach her was Mrs. Mildred Fenton, the village gossip, whose rosy cheeks and plump figure belied her razor-sharp tongue. She immediately launched into a tirade about the latest scandal involving the local farmer, Mr. Andrews, whose cows had inexplicably started producing sour milk. "Do you know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Fenton said, her voice dripping with excitement, "I've heard that Mr. Andrews has been seen sneaking around the back of his barn late at night, and there's something dreadfully odd about the whole thing. Some say it's witchcraft, but I think it's just a case of a farmer trying to get out of paying for proper care for his herd. He's always been a bit tight with his purse strings." Miss Marple, smiling politely, nodded along as Mrs. Fenton continued, her words tumbling over one another in a never-ending stream of speculation. Miss Marple had long since learned to tune out the more outrageous gossip, but she appreciated the opportunity to hear what was on the minds of the villagers. They were always quick to share their thoughts, no matter how trivial or unsubstantiated. And it was in these moments of idle chatter that Miss Marple often caught glimpses of things that others missed, things that didn't quite fit, tiny irregularities in the otherwise smooth fabric of village life. Miss Marple's attention soon drifted to the corner of the room, where Mrs. Blackwood was overseeing the tea service with her usual poise and control. Letitia Blackwood was a striking woman, though age was beginning to show in the lines of her face and the silver strands in her hair. She had once been a great beauty in her youth, but now she carried herself with a regal sort of melancholy, as if resigned to the passage of time. Still, she commanded attention whenever she entered a room, and Miss Marple knew that Letitia enjoyed the status of being the undisputed queen of local society. The conversation in the room turned to books, as it often did among the more intellectual members of Chipping Cleghorn. Mrs. Blackwood had recently joined the village book club, a modest gathering of like-minded individuals who met once a month to discuss the latest bestsellers or classic works of literature. The current book being discussed was a detective novel, one that had garnered some attention for its rather dramatic plot twists and intricate murder mystery. "I must say," Letitia began, her voice dripping with disdain, "that I find most modern crime novels utterly absurd. They're full of those dreadfully cliched detectives who seem to solve everything by accident. Don't you agree, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple, who had a fondness for detective novels herself, merely smiled. She had never been one to engage in literary debates, preferring to listen to others' opinions rather than offering her own. "I'm afraid I'm not as well versed in the genre as you, Letitia," she replied, her tone warm and measured. "But I do think that sometimes the most interesting mysteries are those that are closer to home, in the lives of ordinary people." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes twinkled, clearly amused by the comment. "Ah, Miss Marple, always the philosopher. But I must admit, I do like a good mystery, even if it is a bit far-fetched at times." As the conversation continued, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the bookshelves behind Mrs. Blackwood, where rows of neatly organized volumes sat in perfect order. It was a carefully curated collection, filled with classics, bestsellers, and the occasional antique book that had been passed down through the generations. But it was one book in particular that caught her attention. A small leather-bound volume, slightly out of place among the others. The book sat at the end of the shelf, its spine turned slightly toward the viewer, as if it had been hurriedly placed there and forgotten. It was an old book, its cover worn and faded with age. It wasn't the sort of book one would expect to find in Mrs. Blackwood's collection. In fact, Miss Marple was almost certain that she had never seen it before. As she studied the book, a strange sense of unease settled over her. There was something about it that didn't quite fit, something that felt wrong. But before she could dwell on it further, the conversation around her began to pick up again, and she turned her attention back to her companions. It was then that a high-pitched scream echoed through the manor, slicing through the otherwise serene atmosphere of the gathering. The shriek came from the direction of the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. The guests froze, their faces draining of colour as they turned toward the source of the noise. "What on earth was that?" Mrs. Blackwood exclaimed, clutching her chest in alarm. Without waiting for an answer, she rushed toward the hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the wooden floors. The other guests, wide-eyed with shock, followed in a disorganized scramble, their hands trembling as they hurried after her. Miss Marple, ever composed, took a moment to steady herself before rising from her seat and following at a slower pace. She had learned long ago that it was better to observe from the periphery in moments of chaos. Rushing headlong into the fray rarely yielded any useful information. When Miss Marple arrived at the scene, the hallway was a scene of utter confusion. Mrs. Blackwood was standing at the foot of the grand staircase, her hand clutched to her mouth in shock. The guests had gathered around a figure lying motionless at the base of the stairs. Oliver Sharp, the village librarian. Oliver was a quiet, unassuming man, someone who had spent most of his life in the background of village life. His thick-rimmed glasses were askew on his face, and his usually neat appearance had been disrupted by the unnatural way he was sprawled across the floor. His eyes were wide open, staring in an expression of pure terror, but there was no sign of a struggle. His body was unnervingly still. "Oh, my God, Oliver!" Mrs. Blackwood gasped, her voice trembling. "What happened?" The other guests began to murmur in confusion, their voices rising in a chorus of shock and disbelief. Miss Marple stood quietly at the back of the group, observing the scene with the detached calm that she was known for. She noted the way the villagers reacted, some with genuine horror, others with more curiosity, and a few who seemed almost too eager to know the details. It was a typical reaction to a sudden, unexplained event, and Miss Marple had seen it many times before. Within minutes, Constable Phelps arrived, his face flushed with the exertion of hurrying to the scene. He was a mild-mannered man, prone to nervousness, and his disorganized approach to the situation only added to the confusion. He immediately began to assess the body, his hands trembling as he bent down to check for signs of life. "Stay calm, everyone," Constable Phelps instructed, his voice wavering. "Please don't touch anything. We'll need to wait for the police from the station." Section 2. A quiet investigation. The morning after Oliver Sharp's death, Chipping Cleghorn seemed oddly subdued. The sun, though shining brightly, did little to lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the village. Miss Marple, as always, had risen early, a habit ingrained over decades, and now found herself seated in her small tidy kitchen, sipping her tea with the same contemplative air she wore every morning. The villagers, particularly the more excitable ones, were buzzing with whispered theories about the librarian's sudden collapse, if one could even call it that. There was still no official word on what had happened. The constable, for all his best efforts, had managed only the vaguest of observations, and it seemed that Oliver's sudden demise would remain an enigma for the moment. Miss Marple had her suspicions, though. Her mind, sharp and attentive, had already begun to weave together the threads of the previous day's events. She had not been one to simply accept the surface explanation of things, especially when they seemed too simple. Oliver's fall, his death, had been unnatural, but not in a way that suggested a struggle or a violent crime. No, it was something subtler, something buried beneath layers of human emotion and hidden motives. As much as she was not one to rush into conclusions, Miss Marple had already begun her quiet investigation. She had a quiet way of entering a room, slipping into the shadows, unnoticed, until she was ready to speak. It was precisely this skill that had allowed her to gather the most accurate information from the most unsuspecting of sources. And this morning, as she strolled through Chipping Cleghorn's cobblestone streets, she was greeted by the usual calm murmur of daily life. But beneath the surface, she could sense the ripple of gossip, the undercurrents of uncertainty. Everyone was talking about the night's events. Everyone was wondering what had really happened to Oliver Sharp. Her first stop was the village shop, a small but well-kept establishment run by Miss Dorothy Hargreaves, a widow with a sharp wit and even sharper eyes. Dorothy had known everything about everyone in Chipping Cleghorn, and while she kept her counsel, Miss Marple had often found her to be an invaluable source of information. Miss Marple entered the shop, the bell above the door giving a small welcoming chime. Dorothy was behind the counter, sorting through a pile of receipts. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her lips curling into a smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, what brings you here today? I imagine you've heard all the gossip from the manor," Dorothy said, her voice low, but not without a note of intrigue. "I have indeed, Dorothy," Miss Marple replied, her tone nonchalant, "though I must admit I'm less interested in the gossip and more in the facts, such as they are." Dorothy raised an eyebrow, setting down the receipts with a soft thud. "Well, you won't find much in the way of facts, I'm afraid. The constable seems to think it's just a case of Oliver tripping and falling down the stairs, but we all know that's not quite right, don't we?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already racing. "Indeed, it's an odd business. Did wonder if you had seen anything out of the ordinary last evening, anything that might have caught your attention." Dorothy considered the question for a moment, her fingers absently tapping on the counter. "Well, now that you mention it, I did notice something a little strange. Mrs. Blackwood's guests were all rather agitated, especially the young ones. I'm not sure what it was that set them off, but there was a lot of murmuring going on. I overheard a few things, though nothing that seemed too important at the time. But after what happened to Oliver, I'm not so sure." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp. "Do tell me, Dorothy. You know how I dislike leaving any stone unturned." "Well, it's just a little odd," Dorothy said, lowering her voice as if to ensure no one else could hear. "Overheard young Felix Pearson, he's that handsome chap who works over at the chemist, talking about a book. He seemed particularly agitated about it, but when I tried to ask him what he was on about, he quickly changed the subject. It wasn't the first time I've noticed him acting nervous, but after last night, well, it's all a bit suspicious." Miss Marple took note of Dorothy's observation. Felix Pearson was certainly a young man, with a reputation for being charming, but somewhat flighty. It wasn't the first time she had heard whispers of his peculiarities. His involvement, or rather his apparent distress, over some mysterious book seemed worth looking into. But it was also important to remember that the village had its share of gossips and half-baked stories. It would not do to jump to conclusions prematurely. "Well, thank you, Dorothy," Miss Marple said, her voice soft with appreciation. "I shall keep that in mind. Now, I wonder if I might borrow a moment of your time to examine something of my own." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what might that be, Miss Marple? I've been wondering about a book I saw at Mrs. Blackwood's house yesterday." Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing with the faintest trace of suspicion. A book that didn't quite seem to belong among the others. You wouldn't happen to know if anyone has been borrowing any books recently, would you? Dorothy's expression flickered for a moment, but it quickly returned to its usual unreadable state. Borrowing books? Oh, I'm sure Mrs. Blackwood has lent a few out. She's always sending people off with some tome or other. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the brief hesitation in Dorothy's voice, a subtle crack in her otherwise composed demeanour. "Thank you, Dorothy," she said, her tone warm but knowing. "You've been most helpful." With that, Miss Marple left the shop, her mind already turning over the new information. A book that didn't belong? It was a strange lead, but not one that could be ignored. Her next destination was, of course, Mrs. Blackwood's manor. She needed to see the book for herself. When Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Blackwood's house, she was met with a more subdued atmosphere than the day before. The manor, though still impressive with its grand windows and ivy-covered stone walls, seemed somehow less welcoming in the harsh light of morning. The guests from the night before had long since departed, and Mrs. Blackwood herself was nowhere to be found, though Miss Marple was certain she would be in her study, poring over the details of Oliver Sharp's death in an attempt to make sense of it all. Miss Marple made her way through the hallways, her footsteps light but deliberate. She passed the drawing-room where the tea party had taken place, its elegant furnishings still in disarray from the previous day. As she passed the bookshelves, her gaze once again landed on the small leather-bound book, the one that had caught her attention yesterday. There it was again, sitting slightly askew on the shelf, as if it had been hastily placed there and forgotten. She couldn't resist the urge any longer. Reaching for the book, she pulled it down from the shelf, examining its worn cover. It was, indeed, an old volume, its title embossed in faded gold letters, The Secrets of Chipping Cleghorn. Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly. The Secrets of Chipping Cleghorn. She had heard the name before, in hushed tones, spoken by one of the older villagers who had mentioned the book in passing. It was an obscure volume, written by a long-forgotten historian who had made a study of the village's early history and its more sordid secrets. According to rumour, the book had been lost for years, its whereabouts unknown, but it had recently resurfaced in Mrs. Blackwood's collection. Now, Miss Marple had no doubt that it was significant. She tucked the book under her arm and made her way toward the study. There was no doubt in her mind that she was about to uncover something important. She just didn't yet know what it would be. But as Miss Marple walked through the house, the whispers of the past seemed to echo louder, urging her forward. There was something hidden in this village, something far darker than anyone had realized. Section 3. The First Suspect. The following day brought a subtle change to the atmosphere of Chipping Cleghorn. The village, accustomed to routine and predictability, now seemed consumed by the weight of Oliver Sharp's death. The townsfolk were still shaken by the tragic event, but none more so than Mrs. Blackwood. The elegant widow, once the picture of composure, had been noticeably frail in the days following the incident. Her usual gatherings, which were once a fixture in the village's social calendar, had been indefinitely postponed. The air at Blackwood Manor felt heavy and tense, as though the walls themselves were aware of the dark cloud that had descended upon the estate. Miss Marple, having spent a peaceful night reflecting on the events, found herself drawn back to Blackwood Manor. The book she had discovered earlier, The Secrets of Chipping Cleghorn, was no longer an inconspicuous item on a bookshelf. It had become the linchpin in her mind, the thing that might unlock a door that had remained closed to the police and to the villagers. Her footsteps were soft as she approached the house, but there was something about the manner in which she walked, deliberate yet casual, that gave her an air of purpose. She knew that people in Chipping Cleghorn were inclined to overlook her. The village's view of her as a sweet, elderly woman worked to her advantage. People underestimated her, and in this case it would prove invaluable. Upon entering the manor, Miss Marple was immediately greeted by Mrs. Blackwood's housekeeper, Mrs. Grange, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air about her. Her grey hair was tied tightly in a bun, and her sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing, though Miss Marple had noticed that Mrs. Grange, like many people, was not entirely aware of what was happening under her own roof. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely to see you again," Mrs. Grange said, her voice thick with an air of fatigue. "I trust you're not here to trouble Mrs. Blackwood too much. She's not in the best of spirits today, I'm afraid." "Oh, I'm sure she is, Mrs. Grange," Miss Marple said with a soft, understanding smile. "I've no intention of troubling her. I'm just hoping for a small chat. I do hope you'll be able to assist me." Mrs. Grange hesitated for a moment, but seeing the polite determination in Miss Marple's eyes, she eventually relented. "If you must," she muttered, leading Miss Marple down the narrow hallway toward the study. The room, when they entered, was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the sunlight streaming through the windows. Mrs. Blackwood sat by the fire, her posture stiff as she gazed into the flickering flames. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed the tension that had settled deep into her bones. Miss Marple's approach was gentle, her presence so unobtrusive that Mrs. Blackwood didn't seem to notice her at first. When she did, the widow startled slightly and turned her face toward the older woman, her expression strained but polite. "Miss Marple," she greeted her softly, "I hadn't expected you. But I suppose it's not unexpected that you'd come to visit after the events of yesterday. I hardly know what to think, to be honest." Miss Marple took a seat across from Mrs. Blackwood, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I quite understand, Mrs. Blackwood. There are many emotions at play, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be for you. But I wondered if I might ask you a few questions, if you feel up to it." The widow nodded slowly, her hands tightening around the edges of her gown as though trying to keep herself from unravelling. "Ask away, Miss Marple. I don't see how it could help, but I suppose it might distract me from all the nonsense people are spreading around here. So many questions, so many people making wild guesses. It's all too much." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with a quiet understanding. "I do know what you mean. People can be very quick to jump to conclusions. I trust that the constable has been thorough in his inquiries." Mrs. Blackwood gave a dry laugh, though it lacked any humour. "Thorough? He's been useless, Miss Marple. All he seems to do is ask the same questions over and over. No answers, no conclusions." I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her gaze soft but calculating. "And was there anything unusual in Mr. Sharp's behaviour yesterday? Anything at all that you noticed?" The widow bit her lip, her brow furrowing as she reflected. "Well, now that you mention it, he was acting strange, yes. He seemed on edge, nervous even. But then he was always a bit, well, particular. It wasn't anything that would have raised an eyebrow on its own, of course. But there was a certain tension in him that day. He kept looking at his watch as though he were expecting something or someone to arrive. It wasn't until after he left that I thought about it properly." Miss Marple nodded as she listened, her mind piecing the fragments together. Expecting someone, that could be an important detail. "Did Mr. Sharp leave in any particular hurry?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as measured as ever. Mrs. Blackwood shifted in her chair uncomfortably. "He did, yes. I thought at first that he might have been called away unexpectedly, but that didn't seem to be the case. He simply left, muttering something about needing to get back to his library, and I thought nothing of it at the time. But when I think about it now, it seems strange, doesn't it? The man always seemed so precise, so deliberate. He wasn't the type to leave without a word." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile, though it was more to herself than to Mrs. Blackwood. "I would say it is strange indeed, Mrs. Blackwood. But, as you said, I'm sure it's nothing more than a bit of nervousness." The widow seemed to relax at the thought. "Yes, I suppose so. He was always a bit tense. And yet there was something in his demeanour that I can't quite shake, as if he were trying to hide something. But you know how it is in these matters. People are always hiding things." "Quite," Miss Marple said softly, standing up to leave. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. I won't take any more of your time today, but I do believe we're getting closer to understanding what really happened to Mr. Sharp." As Miss Marple left the room, she could hear Mrs. Blackwood's sigh of relief behind her. But the pieces of the puzzle were starting to take shape. Mrs. Blackwood's distracted behaviour, her mention of Mr. Sharp leaving in a hurry, the tension in the air, it all suggested that there was more to this than met the eye. Miss Marple had to dig deeper, but she felt sure that the answers were just beyond her reach. And then, as if on cue, a new character entered the scene, someone who would quickly become the focus of suspicion. Felix Pearson, the chemist's assistant. His connection to the book, the odd behaviour at the manor the night before, and his palpable distress all made him an ideal candidate for Miss Marple's next focus. But what was it about Felix Pearson that made Miss Marple so uneasy? She couldn't put her finger on it just yet, but she had a feeling that the young man was hiding something. And it was only a matter of time before she would find out exactly what it was. Section 4. Felix Pearson's secret. Felix Pearson had been a fixture in Chipping Cleghorn for the better part of 3 years. A quiet young man, no more than 25, he worked as an assistant at the local chemist's shop. His dark hair, perpetually falling in slight disarray over his forehead, and his solemn, almost nervous expression made him a subject of quiet speculation among the villagers. They didn't know much about his past, and he had been careful to keep it that way. Most simply assumed he was a solitary sort, content in his humble position, living a life of peace. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that appearances were often deceiving. After her visit to Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Marple felt her curiosity stirred further. Felix Pearson had crossed her mind in the past, though she'd never quite taken the time to investigate him. He had shown a marked interest in Mr. Sharp's affairs in recent months, a detail that Miss Marple had overlooked in her initial assessment of the situation. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed that Felix was connected to Oliver Sharp's death, perhaps more than anyone realized. It was late in the afternoon when Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the chemist's shop. The weather had turned colder, and a light mist had settled over the village. The cobblestone streets glistened with the dampness, and the soft clinking of a horse-drawn cart echoed down the lane as Miss Marple approached the chemist's door. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of lavender and herbs, the air heavy with the scent of ointments and tinctures. Felix was behind the counter, his usual expression of quiet contemplation on his face. His eyes flicked toward the door as Miss Marple entered, and a brief moment of surprise crossed his features before he quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Felix greeted her, his voice low and steady. "Can I help you today?" Miss Marple returned his smile, her hands clasped in front of her. "I was hoping for a little chat, Felix. I trust I'm not interrupting anything important?" He shook his head, though his fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of a small vial in his hand. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Please, come in. I'm afraid I don't have much to offer. But if there's anything I can do for you, I'll do my best." "Thank you, Felix," Miss Marple said, stepping further into the small shop. She glanced around, noting the neat rows of bottles and jars, but her attention remained fixed on the young man. "I understand you've been quite close with Mr. Sharp these past few months. Is that right?" Felix stiffened at the mention of Mr. Sharp's name, and Miss Marple saw the faintest flicker of unease pass through his eyes. He took a slow breath before replying, his voice almost too measured. "Yes, Mr. Sharp was a frequent customer. He had some concerns about his health. I often made certain preparations for him." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. "How interesting! And what sort of preparations did he ask for, exactly?" Felix hesitated, his eyes darting toward the back of the shop as though seeking an escape. "Just general remedies. Nothing unusual. He was quite private about his health, you see. I never pressed him for details." "But you must have known something of his condition," Miss Marple pressed gently. "After all, you prepared the remedies yourself. Did he ever tell you what he was concerned about?" Felix's hand clenched tightly around the vial, and Miss Marple noticed his knuckles turning white. He was avoiding her gaze now, staring at the counter as though focusing on an invisible spot. I don't think I should speak of it, Miss Marple. It's not my place to—" "Oh, Felix," Miss Marple interrupted softly, her voice lilting with understanding. "You're a young man of good character, I can see that. But there are matters at play here that concern us all. We all want the truth, and sometimes speaking the truth is the only way to prevent something worse from happening." Felix's breath quickened, his eyes darting around the room before finally landing on Miss Marple's calm, patient gaze. He seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment before he spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I didn't mean to seem evasive. Mr. Sharp was concerned about someone, and he was very specific about it. He kept saying that he feared he was being followed, watched by someone he couldn't see. He seemed very agitated, and he mentioned a few names. one of which was Mrs. Blackwood. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Blackwood, the widow, had been so composed in her own account of events, so careful with her words, but now there was a deeper connection that began to form. Why would Mr. Sharp have mentioned Mrs. Blackwood if he wasn't deeply involved with her in some way? Mrs. Blackwood, Miss Marple echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. And did he say why he was worried about her? Felix hesitated, his hands shaking slightly as he set the vial down on the counter. He seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing. He didn't say why, but he was convinced that something was wrong. He thought someone in the village was conspiring against him. That's why he asked me to prepare something to calm his nerves. He said he couldn't think clearly anymore. He was losing his grip on what was real. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle that was starting to take shape. Mr. Sharp's paranoia, his mention of Mrs. Blackwood, the mysterious book that no one had borrowed, all of it was beginning to intertwine. "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "And did you happen to see Mr. Sharp leave that day? Or perhaps did you notice anything unusual about his departure?" Felix's face darkened, and he looked away from her, his voice barely a murmur. "No, I didn't see him leave, but I think he was hiding something. Something he didn't want anyone to find. He was very secretive about it, and I think that's what led to, well, what happened." "Something he didn't want anyone to find?" Miss Marple repeated, her interest piqued. "Do you think he was aware of a threat, perhaps from someone within the village?" Felix's eyes flickered briefly toward the back of the shop before returning to Miss Marple. "I don't know, Miss Marple, I really don't. But I think he was trying to protect someone, or perhaps he was trying to hide something he feared could ruin him." Miss Marple stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on Felix's words. It was becoming clearer now. Oliver Sharp had been hiding something significant enough to make him feel paranoid, even fearful for his life. And if his fear had been justified, it meant that the answer to his death was far from simple. Felix Pearson, the quiet assistant with a hidden past, was no longer just a bystander in this mystery. Miss Marple knew she would have to dig deeper into his connection with Mr. Sharp and with Mrs. Blackwood if she hoped to uncover the truth. And so Miss Marple left the chemist's shop, her mind sharper than ever, knowing that the next steps, in this case, would lead her even closer to the answers she sought. Section 5. A Hidden Motive. The following morning, the village of Chipping-Cleghorn was unusually quiet. The streets, typically filled with the hum of daily life, seemed almost still. Miss Marple, however, was far from idle. She had spent the night turning over in her mind the details Felix Pearson had shared. Something about his story didn't sit quite right with her. Oliver Sharp's paranoia, his cryptic fears of being watched, and his mention of Mrs. Blackwood were all pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to feel much darker than anyone could have imagined. As the sun rose, casting its soft golden light over the picturesque village, Miss Marple made her way to the village square, her thoughts focused. She had a few stops to make today, one of which was the home of Mrs. Blackwood. If Sharp had been afraid of her, then perhaps she was hiding something more than just her usual aloofness. The question now was what Mrs. Blackwood knew, and whether It could explain the strange death of Oliver Sharp. Miss Marple had already learned that the widow was one of the more enigmatic figures in the village. She had lived in Chipping Cleghorn for nearly 15 years, having arrived with her late husband, a man of some local importance. Since his passing, Mrs. Blackwood had kept largely to herself, her only regular outings being to the local church, and the occasional tea with select friends. She had always struck Miss Marple as someone who carefully managed her image. Never too chatty, never too open, but always maintaining a polite and composed facade. It was just after noon when Miss Marple arrived at the Blackwood residence, a stately house on the outskirts of the village. It was set back from the main road, its ivy-clad stone walls giving it an air of seclusion. The garden was well kept, with roses blooming in carefully tended beds. The door opened almost immediately when Miss Marple knocked, and standing before her was Mrs. Blackwood, dressed in a modest but elegant blue dress. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice as smooth as always. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but measured. "I simply thought it would be good to check in, considering all that's happened in the village. The death of Mr. Sharp, of course, is most unsettling." Mrs. Blackwood's expression shifted, though only slightly. A faint flicker of something, perhaps surprise or concern, flashed in her eyes before she masked it with a polite smile. "Yes, it has been quite a shock. I hadn't known him well, but it is tragic nonetheless." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, studying the widow's face closely. "I was speaking with Felix Pearson this morning. He mentioned that Mr. Sharp had confided in him about his concerns, his fears that he was being watched. Do you know anything about that? Mr. Sharp seemed to think that someone was following him, or perhaps even conspiring against him." At the mention of Oliver Sharp's name, Mrs. Blackwood's face tightened imperceptibly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm afraid I have no knowledge of that, Miss Marple. Oliver Sharp was always a bit of a mystery to me. I don't believe he was the sort of man to make such claims lightly, though. Perhaps he was just ill," Miss Marple observed the widow carefully. Mrs. Blackwood's words were polite, yet there was a certain coldness in her voice, as if she were trying to distance herself from any involvement in the matter. Miss Marple, however, was not easily swayed. "You know," Miss Marple began, her tone thoughtful, "I had the distinct impression that Mr. Sharp was a man who had something to hide. He was a private man, yes, but the more I learn about him, the more I suspect there was something he was trying to protect." Mrs. Blackwood's smile faltered, and for just a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of guilt cross her face. It was so brief that it could have been a trick of the light, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes did not miss it. "I don't think I understand, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice taking on a note of uncertainty. "What could Mr. Sharp have had to protect? His health? I thought he was quite well, despite his recent complaints." "Ah, his health," Miss Marple mused, her gaze steady. "I wonder, Mrs. Blackwood, if it wasn't his health he was so worried about after all. Perhaps it was something or someone closer to him." Mrs. Blackwood blinked at Miss Marple, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I know nothing about his personal matters. I hardly think I could help you with your investigation." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as though considering Mrs. Blackwood's words. Then, with a small, seemingly idle smile, she said, "No, perhaps not. But then again, sometimes the smallest of details can be of great importance. Wouldn't you agree?" Mrs. Blackwood's composure faltered again, and Miss Marple noted the briefest tremor in her hand as she reached for the door handle to close it. "I'm afraid I must go now, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood said, her tone becoming slightly more strained. "I'm not sure how else I can be of assistance. Thank you for your visit." With that, the door was gently closed, leaving Miss Marple standing in the quiet afternoon air, her thoughts swirling. There was something in Mrs. Blackwood's reaction that Miss Marple found deeply unsettling. She had not admitted anything, nor had she given away a direct clue, but the widow's defensiveness was telling. Mrs. Blackwood's attempt to brush aside any deeper inquiry only made Miss Marple more convinced that the widow had knowledge she wasn't sharing. Before Miss Marple could formulate her next move, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was a soft, hesitant voice, a voice Miss Marple knew all too well. Miss Marple? Turning around, Miss Marple saw none other than Felix Pearson, standing a few feet away, looking unusually out of place in the garden. He was holding a small package in his hands, his nervous energy palpable as he approached her. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I thought you should know. I might have been wrong about something, about Mr. Sharp. There's something you need to see." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Something I need to see, Felix. Whatever could it be?" Hesitated for a moment, then thrust the package into Miss Marple's hands. She glanced at it, small, wrapped in plain brown paper, and tied with a piece of string. "This," Felix said, his eyes flicking nervously to the house behind her, "was something Mr. Sharp left for me. He told me to keep it hidden, to only give it to someone when I thought it was time." Miss Marple carefully untied the string and opened the package. Inside was a leather-bound book, its cover worn with age. The pages, however, were intact, and Miss Marple's fingers brushed lightly over the surface. She didn't need to open it to understand that this book was important. It was a key to unlocking the secrets that had driven Oliver Sharp to fear for his life. Felix's voice broke through her thoughts. "I think you need to read it, Miss Marple. It's all in there. Everything." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing with the implications of this new development. She knew that whatever secrets lay within the pages of this book, they were likely the final piece in solving this puzzling and ever more dangerous mystery. Section 6. The Secrets Unfold. Miss Marple sat down on the stone bench near the garden's edge, the book now in her lap. Felix Pearson stood nervously beside her, hands wringing the edges of his coat. The weight of the moment was palpable. Whatever secrets this book held, they could be the key to unraveling Oliver Sharp's cryptic death. She opened the book carefully, her fingers tracing the faded lettering on the first page. It was not a typical ledger or diary, but rather a collection of cryptic notes, sketches, and disjointed observations. The first few pages were filled with what appeared to be Sharp's personal reflections. Mundane at first, discussing his work and daily life. However, as Miss Marple turned the pages, the tone shifted. There were notes on various people in the village, seemingly benign observations at first. The town's merchants, the vicar, and even Mrs. Blackwood. But as the entries became more frequent, Miss Marple noted a pattern. Sharp had been keeping track of events, conversations and behaviours. He had made a record of the comings and goings of several individuals, including one person who had appeared on his list more often than anyone else, Felix Pearson. On one particular page, a line stood out in bold, underlined text. Felix Pearson knows more than he's telling. Miss Marple glanced at Felix, whose face had gone ashen. "Felix!" Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady but piercing. "What is this?" Felix shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking nervously to the ground. I didn't think he would have put that in there. I didn't want to believe it either. But Mr. Sharp, he knew things about me, about my past, things I didn't want anyone to know." Miss Marple closed the book with a gentle snap, her eyes narrowing as she studied Felix. "What is it you're hiding, Felix?" Felix took a shaky breath before speaking, his voice quiet. "Before I came to Chipping Cleghorn, I was involved in some things back in London. I worked for a small law firm, but I was more involved than I should have been. Things that, if exposed, could ruin me. I didn't want anyone here to know about it. I was trying to start over." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And Mr. Sharp, did he find out about these things?" Felix nodded reluctantly. "He must have. He started asking questions, watching me. I didn't know who else to trust. But I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't kill him. I would never harm him." Miss Marple observed him for a long moment. "I don't believe you're the killer, Felix. But I do think Mr. Sharp knew something dangerous, something that could ruin him if it got out. He was trying to protect himself, wasn't he?" Felix's face twisted with guilt. "I think he was. But not just me. He knew things about Mrs. Blackwood too, about her late husband, and the real reason she moved here, and he was threatening to tell people." "Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple repeated, intrigued. "That is an interesting connection. What did he know about her?" Felix hesitated. He didn't say much, but he implied that Mrs. Blackwood's late husband, Lord Blackwood, had been involved in some shady dealings. I don't know the details, but it was something that would have caused a scandal if it ever came to light. Sharp said he'd seen documents, records of transactions, things that could tie him to organized crime. Miss Marple's eyes grew sharper. "And where are these documents now?" Felix shook his head. "I don't know. I never saw them. But I think that's why Mrs. Blackwood was so protective of the house. She knew Sharp had discovered something, and if he'd gone public with it, everything would be exposed. That's why I think she might have been involved in his death." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, processing Felix's words. She could see the anxiety in his eyes, but she also sensed that he was trying to protect someone. Or something. "You don't think it was Mrs. Blackwood, do you, Felix?" Miss Marple asked. Felix's voice trembled as he replied, "I don't know what to think any more. There are too many secrets, Miss Marple, and I'm afraid that if I get too close to the truth, I might not like what I find." Miss Marple nodded. "It's always easier to stay in the dark, Felix. But sometimes we must shine a light on the shadows, no matter how uncomfortable it might be." With that, she stood up, the book still in her hands. "I believe we have a few more questions to ask Mrs. Blackwood. I think it's time we visited her again." Felix looked up at Miss Marple, a mixture of fear and relief in his eyes. "Do you think she'll confess?" "I don't know," Miss Marple replied, "but we must be prepared to listen carefully. People like Mrs. Blackwood are often better at hiding the truth than they are at revealing it." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple felt a sense of urgency. The web of secrets was tightening around the widow, and she was growing, increasingly certain that Mrs. Blackwood's connection to Oliver Sharp's death was far from accidental. The question now was whether Mrs. Blackwood would continue to play her cards close to her chest, or whether she would finally reveal what she knew. When they arrived at the Blackwood residence, the house seemed darker than before, its imposing walls standing silently against the afternoon light. Miss Marple knocked on the door once more, and once again Mrs. Blackwood appeared. This time, however, her smile seemed a little less practised, her eyes a little more guarded. "Miss Marple, back again," she said, her voice a touch cooler than before. "What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I have a few more questions," Miss Marple said, her tone firm yet polite. "You see, I've been doing some thinking, and there are a few things I need to understand about Oliver Sharp's death." Mrs. Blackwood's expression tightened, but she stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple and Felix to enter. "You seem to have found more information, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with a hint of concern. "But I assure you, I know nothing more than I've already told you." Miss Marple took a seat, her gaze steady. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mrs. Blackwood. You see, I have reason to believe that Mr. Sharp may have known more about your late husband's dealings than you care to admit. I also believe that you may have had a hand in silencing him." Mrs. Blackwood stiffened, her face now pale. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "I'm implying," Miss Marple said gently, "that sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lies we tell ourselves." The silence in the room was palpable as Miss Marple's words sank in, and she could see the storm of emotions that passed behind Mrs. Blackwood's composed exterior. This was it, the moment when the truth would finally emerge. Section 7. The web of lies. Mrs. Blackwood's face froze, her posture rigid as she stood before Miss Marple. The room, once so elegantly arranged, now felt stifling, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "I assure you, Miss Marple, you're mistaken," Mrs. Blackwood replied, her voice controlled but laced with a tremor of anxiety. "I had nothing to do with Oliver Sharp's death. I don't even know what you're implying." Miss Marple gave a slight smile, one that was more knowing than kind. "I think you know more than you're letting on, Mrs. Blackwood. You've been very careful with your words so far, but there are some things even the most meticulous can't hide." Felix shifted nervously beside Miss Marple, his eyes darting between the two women. The tension in the room was palpable, and it seemed as though the walls themselves might close in on them. Mrs. Blackwood turned away, pacing slowly toward the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You're wasting your time, Miss Marple. I didn't even know Oliver Sharp well. He was a nuisance, that's all. A man with too many questions and not enough answers. Why would I want to kill him?" Miss Marple took a deep breath and slowly stood. Her movements were deliberate, as though every inch she took toward Mrs. Blackwood was calculated. Because Mrs. Blackwood, he knew something dangerous, Something about your late husband's dealings. Something that, if exposed, would destroy everything you've built here." Mrs. Blackwood stiffened, her back now fully turned to Miss Marple. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked loudly, breaking the silence that had overtaken the room. Mr. Sharp wasn't the only one who knew about your husband's ties to organised crime, Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. "There are records, documents, things that could ruin you, and you didn't want anyone to find them. That's why you made sure Mr. Sharp would never speak of them again." Felix looked at Miss Marple, his brow furrowing. "You're suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood—" "Not suggesting, Felix," Miss Marple interrupted, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Blackwood's rigid form. "I'm stating a fact. Mrs. Blackwood knew Sharp was on the verge of revealing her husband's past, and when he started threatening her, she took action." Mrs. Blackwood's shoulders trembled ever so slightly, but she didn't turn around. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost too soft. "I didn't kill him. I would never have done that. You don't understand. Everything I've built here, everything I've worked for, it's all I have left." Miss Marple's eyes softened for a brief moment, but her words were still sharp. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Blackwood. You've built a life here, a life that depends on secrets being kept. But there's one thing you've overlooked. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried." Mrs. Blackwood slowly turned to face Miss Marple, her face now pale, her lips trembling. "What do you want from me?" Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice steady and unyielding. "I want the truth. I want to know what you and your late husband were involved in. And I want to know why Oliver Sharp had to die for it." The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes seemed to search the room, as if weighing her options, deciding whether to keep up the facade or let the truth slip through the cracks. Finally, with a long, reluctant sigh, she spoke. "I never wanted anyone to know about Lord Blackwood's dealings. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He had connections, dangerous ones. But when he died, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I could bury everything with him." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. "But Oliver Sharp," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice faltering, "he started asking questions. He came to me, asking about Lord Blackwood's business, about some old associates he thought were involved in shady dealings. I never confirmed anything, of course, but I knew what he was getting at. He wanted to expose me, expose us." Felix took a step forward. "So, you threatened him?" "No," Mrs. Blackwood said quickly, shaking her head. "I didn't threaten him. But I did. I did warn him to stay away from those matters. I told him to stop digging into things that didn't concern him. But Oliver didn't listen. He kept pushing. I think he thought he could force me into a confession, that I would break under pressure. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't risk it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "So, you didn't kill him, but you wanted him silenced?" Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, biting her lower lip. "I never wanted him dead, but I may have encouraged him to leave Chipping Cleghorn. I spoke to someone, a man from London, someone who knew how to handle people like Oliver Sharp." Felix's eyes widened with realization. "You hired someone to scare him, didn't you?" Mrs. Blackwood's lips pressed tightly together, and she didn't speak. but the guilt in her eyes was undeniable. "I didn't hire him to kill him," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted him to go away. I thought if he left, everything would be fine again." Miss Marple shook her head, her disappointment evident. "You may not have intended for Mr. Sharp to die, but your actions led to it, and now the truth will come to light." Felix stepped closer to Mrs. Blackwood, his expression softening. "What did you think would happen when you pushed someone like Oliver Sharp too far? He wasn't someone who could be intimidated or silenced easily." Mrs. Blackwood's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Felix. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could protect myself, my home, everything I'd built." Miss Marple placed a hand on Felix's arm, her tone more gentle now. "It's time to face the consequences, Mrs. Blackwood. You've carried this burden long enough. It's not too late to make things right." Mrs. Blackwood met Miss Marple's gaze, the weight of her secrets now too much to bear. She took a deep breath, and then, in a voice that cracked under the pressure, she finally said what had been buried for so long. "I didn't kill him, but I know who did." Section 8. The final test, the silence that followed Mrs. Blackwood's confession, hung heavy in the air. Felix and Miss Marple exchanged a glance, but neither spoke. The weight of the moment settled in like a dark cloud, each word more difficult to swallow than the last. "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Blackwood repeated, her voice barely audible. "But I know who did." Miss Marple's sharp gaze never wavered. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes locked onto Mrs. Blackwood's. "Who?" Mrs. Blackwood's face was pale, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting the lace of her gloves with nervous energy. Her gaze flickered toward the door, as if looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. I can't tell you," she whispered, her lips trembling. Felix, growing increasingly impatient, took a step toward her. "Why not? You're telling us everything else. Who killed Oliver Sharp?" Miss Marple, always composed, placed a hand on Felix's shoulder, gently pulling him back. "Let her speak in her own time, Felix. We'll get the truth, but we must be patient." Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes, her breath shallow. After a long moment, she spoke again. The words rushed, as if she feared they might disappear before they were fully formed. "It was George Waters, my gardener." Felix and Miss Marple both froze at the mention of the name. George Waters, the quiet, unassuming man who had worked for Mrs. Blackwood for years. It seemed impossible. Yet the sudden flash of realization that crossed Miss Marple's face was all the confirmation Felix needed. "George Waters," Miss Marple repeated slowly, her voice soft, as if turning the name over in her mind. "And how exactly did he come to kill Mr. Sharp?" Mrs. Blackwood's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers now white with the force of their grip. He was angry at Oliver for asking questions. George had worked for my husband long before I came here. He knew things, dangerous things that, if Oliver had learned them, would have ruined George's life. Felix's brow furrowed. "So, George didn't just work for you. He had a vested interest in keeping Lord Blackwood's past hidden too." Mrs. Blackwood nodded, her face tightening. "Yes, He had his own reasons for wanting to silence Oliver. George, he always had a way of keeping things quiet, keeping people in line. But when Oliver began digging into my husband's affairs, George couldn't let him get too close. Miss Marple, her expression calm but focused, glanced out of the window toward the garden. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the meticulously kept grounds. She knew George Waters too well. The man had always been a shadow at the edge of the village's gossip mill, never quite part of the social circles, but always there, observing, watching. "Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but there was an underlying firmness that drew Mrs. Blackwood's attention. How did George actually kill Mr. Sharp? Mrs. Blackwood hesitated again, a deep breath escaping her before she continued. "I don't know all the details. I didn't want to know. But I think it happened at the meeting, the one Oliver arranged at the old barn just outside the village. George was supposed to go there to confront Oliver and make him stop digging. I didn't know he'd take it that far. I didn't know he would." She trailed off, her voice breaking. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working rapidly. The old barn. She had heard rumours about that place. Of course, George would have chosen it. Out of sight, secluded and hidden from the prying eyes of the village. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" Felix asked, his voice full of frustration. "You could have stopped all of this. You could have told us about George from the beginning." Mrs. Blackwood lowered her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't admit that I was involved in any of it. I thought if I said too much, people would think I had something to do with it, that I had orchestrated it all. I was trying to protect myself, and I was afraid of George. He's not someone you can just confront. He knows things, dangerous things. Miss Marple studied her carefully. It was clear that Mrs. Blackwood was terrified, but there was something else, guilt. Her fear wasn't just of George, it was of her own actions. She had allowed this all to happen, and now she was stuck in the consequences. Felix was pacing now, frustration evident in every step. "We have to find George, Miss Marple. We can't just sit here and wait for him to strike again." Miss Marple raised her hand, stopping Felix mid-stride. "No, Felix, we don't need to find George yet. We need to know where he is, but not just yet. There's still something important we need to understand before we move forward." Felix looked at Miss Marple, confused. "What do you mean? We have a killer to catch." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I know, but before we rush into anything, we need to understand why George acted the way he did, why he thought killing Oliver Sharp was his only option. I suspect there's more to his story, and we must uncover it before we can confront him properly." Felix nodded slowly, though the impatience still lingered in his eyes. Miss Marple had always been the one to see things others missed, but the longer they delayed, the more danger seemed to creep in. "I'll go to the barn," Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice steady and resolute. "I'll go there and see what I can find. But first, I must have a word with Mrs. Blackwood alone." Felix paused at the door, casting a last look over his shoulder. "You're not planning on confronting George alone, are you, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with quiet confidence. "Don't worry, Felix. I'll be fine. I just need to talk to Mrs. Blackwood. You'll see." With a final glance at the garden, Miss Marple waited until Felix had left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Then she turned back to Mrs. Blackwood, whose face was a mixture of anxiety and guilt. "There is one last thing I need to ask you, Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said. "Where is George now?" Mrs. Blackwood's eyes darted nervously around, the room before finally landing on Miss Marple. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know," she stammered. "He's probably hiding, but I've seen him a few times over the past few days, walking near the woods, but I don't know where he is now." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already working. "Then I shall visit the barn and see what I can discover. You should rest, Mrs. Blackwood. The truth is on its way, and you need to be prepared for it." Miss Marple left the room. Her thoughts were focused not only on George Waters, but on the deeper, unspoken truths that seemed to wind through every conversation and every clue. The web of lies was finally beginning to unravel. But there were still mysteries to be uncovered, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that the last piece was often the most surprising. She stepped out into the evening air, the path ahead uncertain, but her resolve unwavering. The truth, as always, would reveal itself in time. Section 9. The Reveal. The cool evening breeze rustled the leaves as Miss Marple made her way toward the old barn on the edge of the village. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of lavender and deep blue, the darkness slowly creeping in. It was the perfect time for secrets to be uncovered, and Miss Marple knew that the key to unlocking the final mystery lay just ahead. As she walked, she reflected on the events that had led her here. Mrs. Blackwood's confession had certainly shaken things up, but there were still unanswered questions, especially concerning George Waters. Why had he taken such drastic measures? And what did he stand to lose? Miss Marple had always believed that the key to solving a crime lay not in evidence, but in understanding the motives behind the actions. What drove a person to commit murder, and how much of that was influenced by the weight of past secrets? She reached the barn, its outline dark against the sky. It looked harmless enough, a weather-beaten structure that seemed a million miles away from the polished elegance of Blackwood House. The barn had been out of sight of the village, tucked away in a small grove of trees, a perfect place for anyone who wanted to avoid attention. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. There were no obvious signs of disturbance, no broken locks, no footprints in the dirt. But Miss Marple was no stranger to the art of observation. She bent down, inspecting the ground carefully. A faint trace of dirt, barely noticeable, was disturbed near the door. She crouched, her fingers gently brushing over the spot. It was a subtle sign, easily missed by anyone not trained to look for the smallest clues. Inside, the barn was dim, the last vestiges of daylight filtering in through cracks in the old wood. The scent of hay and earth lingered in the air. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the place had been abandoned for a long time. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. She moved forward, her footsteps light but deliberate, and her eyes scanned every corner of the barn. The ground was littered with straw and dust, But as she moved deeper into the barn, she spotted something, an overturned crate. It was not an accident. Someone had been in a hurry. Miss Marple approached cautiously, her mind piecing together the scene. She reached down and found a small, crumpled piece of paper hidden beneath the crate. Carefully she unfolded it, revealing a hastily written note. "I will meet you there tonight. It's now or never. G." The handwriting was jagged, rushed. George Waters had clearly been in a state of anxiety, perhaps even desperation. Miss Marple folded the note back up, slipping it into her pocket. This was a significant clue, one that could shed light on the final moments before Oliver Sharp's death. As she continued to investigate the barn, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to George. She had already deduced that he was far more than just a gardener. His long-standing connection to the Blackwood family, his knowledge of their secrets, and his ability to manipulate the people around him had made him a dangerous individual. But why had he killed Oliver? Was it truly just to silence him, or had there been something more personal at play? Just then, a faint noise reached her ears. Footsteps, cautious but deliberate, approaching the barn. Miss Marple froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had not expected anyone to come, not so soon. Could it be George, or perhaps someone else? The door creaked as it opened, and Miss Marple turned to face the newcomer. Her eyes locked onto a tall figure emerging from the shadows. It was George Waters, his face drawn, his expression one of quiet desperation. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I knew you'd come here." Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had known he would be here, of course. She had no illusions about his motivations. The note, the rush of urgency, it all made sense now. She had anticipated his next move. "George," she said calmly, her voice like velvet, "I think we need to talk." George stepped into the barn, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something. But Miss Marple could see that his mind was elsewhere, haunted perhaps by the weight of what he had done. He wasn't the calm, collected man he appeared to be in public. The tension in his body told another story, one of fear and regret. "I don't want to talk to you," George muttered, his gaze lowering. "You've figured everything out, haven't you?" Miss Marple remained silent, watching him carefully. She had no need to speak yet. The silence between them spoke volumes. "I didn't mean to kill him," George continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't. But once he found out, once he started asking questions about the past, I couldn't let him ruin everything. I couldn't—" Miss Marple nodded slowly. She understood now. George's desperation had led him to make a fatal decision. The past, the secrets he had kept buried for so long, had caught up with him, and Oliver Sharp had been the unwitting catalyst. "I didn't have a choice," George repeated, his voice growing more frantic. "He was going to expose everything, all the things I've done, the things I've kept hidden. I didn't know what else to do." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "But George, murder was never the answer. The truth always comes out one way or another, and it will come out now, with or without your confession." His face crumpled as the reality of his situation sank in. He had been caught, cornered by the one person who could see through his carefully constructed facade. There was no escape for him now. the lies, the deceit, they had all led to this moment, this inevitable confrontation. I never wanted it to go this far, George said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted anyone to die. Miss Marple nodded, understanding the complexity of his emotions. But she also knew that intent was not enough to absolve him of his actions. There was no turning back now. You can still make it right, George, she said softly. You can confess, and you can help put things to rest. It's the only way forward. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, George's shoulders sagged, the weight of his guilt overwhelming him. I'll go to the police, he whispered. I'll tell them everything. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. That's all anyone can do in the end. With that, she turned toward the barn door, the sound of George's footsteps behind her. She had known from the start that the truth would come out in the end. It always did. As she walked back toward the village, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. George Waters had been the key, but the real story was far more intricate than anyone had imagined. The book that was never borrowed, the secrets it contained, the lives it touched. Miss Marple had seen it all. And now the quiet peace of the village would return, though not without leaving behind the echoes of its dark past. Miss Marple reflected on the case as she made her way home. It had been a tale of deception, fear, and hidden guilt, but it was also a reminder of how, in the end, nothing could remain concealed forever. As she reached her door, she turned back one last time to glance at the barn in the distance. It was quiet now. The past had been revealed, and the future awaited. Section 10. Aftermath. The morning after George Waters' confession, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed unchanged. The sun rose as it always did, casting a soft golden light over the quiet streets, and the day began in a routine rhythm. Yet, beneath this calm facade, a subtle shift had taken place. The darkness of the previous night still lingered in the thoughts of those who had been involved in the case, and even the slightest noise seemed to echo louder than before. Miss Marple sat in her cosy sitting room sipping her morning tea. Outside, birds chirped in the hedgerows, and the faint hum of life resumed in the village. Yet, for Miss Marple, the case was far from over. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't only about George Waters. There were still ripples of suspicion and tangled threads that would not easily unravel. She had, in the end, been right about George. His desperation, his guilt, his attempt to silence Oliver Sharp had been driven by his deep fear of exposure. But it was not simply Oliver's probing into family secrets that had set him on this path. No, Miss Marple had realized in the final moments of their conversation that there was more at play. A tangled web of betrayal, broken promises, and unspoken resentments. The book that had not been borrowed. Oliver's seemingly casual request to borrow a book from Mrs. Blackwood's library had turned out to be the key that had unlocked the entire mystery. Oliver had been investigating the past, uncovering threads that no one wanted to revisit. The book contained not only family histories, but also delicate truths about the Blackwoods' finances, their past, and their ties to figures who had long since disappeared from the social scene. George had feared that Oliver would unearth these things and expose him. But more than that, he had feared what the exposure would mean for the Blackwoods, whose reputation he had sworn to protect, even at the cost of his own morality. Miss Marple had seen it clearly in George's eyes when he had spoken of his actions. The guilt was not just about killing Oliver, but about the shame he felt for having been complicit in a much darker story. He had been the one to help hide the book, to guard its secrets, and he had known the power it held. And now, as Miss Marple reflected on the events that had transpired, she realized that the web of deceit extended far beyond George and Oliver. There had been other players, other motivations that had gone unnoticed by the police. The quiet villagers, their seemingly placid lives disrupted by the tragedy, had their own versions of the story, their own versions of truth. Miss Marple had not yet shared her observations with the police. She knew that the time would come for that, but she wanted to let the dust settle first. There was still more to consider. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sound of a knock at the door. Miss Marple set down her tea and rose to answer. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Sergeant Goodwin, the local constable. His face was grave, and he held a small envelope in his hand. "Good morning, Sergeant," Miss Marple replied, offering him a chair. "Is there something more I can assist you with?" Sergeant Goodwin sat, looking uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting with the envelope. "We've arrested George Waters, Miss Marple, as you well know. But there's something that doesn't sit right with me. A detail in his confession. It doesn't explain everything. There's a part of the story he's not telling us, and I think you might have some insight into it." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She'd known the confession seemed too clean, too neatly wrapped up. George had admitted to the murder, but Miss Marple had sensed there was something he had not fully accounted for. Something important had been left unsaid, and it would only take a slight push for the truth to reveal itself. "Do tell me more, Sergeant," she said, settling back in her chair. "We've been over the crime scene a dozen times, Miss Marple, and the details of George's confession match. The motive, the method, it all fits. But we found something strange in the library. Something George couldn't have known about unless he'd been there before Oliver's arrival. A piece of paper in a drawer, hidden behind some books. It was a letter addressed to Mrs. Blackwood, with no return address. The handwriting was smudged, but the contents are unmistakable. It's a threatening letter, one that implies someone was trying to use Oliver Sharp to get to the Blackwoods. The letter makes it clear that someone wanted to force Mrs. Blackwood to reveal secrets about her late husband's business dealings. Miss Marple's expression remained impassive, but inside she felt the stirrings of a deeper understanding. The mystery had not been solved, not entirely. There was still a hidden hand at play. "Do you still have the letter?" she asked quietly. Sergeant Goodwin nodded. "I brought it with me. It's odd. Why would George have hidden it? And why was it addressed to Mrs. Blackwood if it had nothing to do with her? It wasn't signed. It's almost as though someone else was trying to manipulate events from behind the scenes." Miss Marple took the envelope from Sergeant Goodwin and carefully unfolded the letter. She read it, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the words. "I know about your husband's debts. I know about your late husband's connections to the business underworld. You cannot keep running from your past. You will help me, or I will expose everything. There are no more safe places." The letter was unsigned, but the message was clear. Someone had been blackmailing Mrs. Blackwood, forcing her to reveal her husband's secrets. Secrets about his financial troubles, perhaps even his involvement in less than legal dealings. But what did this have to do with Oliver's murder? And why had George hidden this letter? "Do you think George was protecting Mrs. Blackwood?" Sergeant Goodwin asked, his brow furrowed. Was he trying to cover up something even worse? Sst! Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind racing as she pieced together the final fragments of the puzzle. "Not just Mrs. Blackwood," she murmured to herself. George was protecting a much larger secret, something that no one else could know. But what he didn't count on was how Oliver's curiosity would lead him into the heart of a very dangerous situation. She stood, her decision made. "I think it's time for one final conversation with Mrs. Blackwood." Sergeant Goodwin nodded. "Shall I accompany you?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a slight smile. "No, Sergeant. This is one conversation I must have alone." As Miss Marple made her way to Blackwood House for the final piece of the puzzle, she felt the weight of everything she had uncovered. The village had been forever changed, and the darkness lurking behind the peaceful facade of St. Mary Mead was no longer hidden.